Eye tracking is something that's been hyped up by many people in the VR industry, and for good reason, but it doesn't feel like all the potential applications of it are being fully utilized. Even dynamic foveated rendering is only just starting to get some attention with various tools on PC, and then Sony's PSVR 2. But besides DFR, another usage of eye tracking is dynamically correcting for lens distortion in order to address the ways that VR lenses stand between you and the rendered image. And a recent software called Almalence promises to do exactly that, leveraging eye tracking to improve a whole host of things, such as pupil swim, like in the video you're seeing right now, chromatic aberration, sharpness, and in general improve your image quality by dynamically correcting for the limitations of the lenses. And it recently got support for the Pimax Crystal here, which made me curious about testing this technology, as I've seen surprisingly few people talking about it. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at today, looking at the image quality, to the best of my abilities, the performance impact, and seeing if this kind of technology is really worth the hype. However, before we do that, it is important to understand a little bit about lens design and why this plugin exists to work around it. Because VR optics, they are an extremely complicated technology. You could make a long video just on lens design, but I lack the equipment to capture good examples, even if I were to spend hours researching for that, so I'll just make this a bit of a brief overview to help give some context on this plugin. We require the use of lenses in order to focus the light coming from the displays in a manner that creates the whole VR effect, and is why it is capable of tricking our senses and being so immersive. If you tried without lenses, it'd be no different than taking your phone, just slapping it against your head. But depending on the kind of lenses, this introduces various problems that the headset designer has to best account for by pre-distorting and warping the image in the distortion profile. One notable example of this is the reason why your headset's render resolution in games has to be so much higher than the base panel resolution. Because one artifact from lenses is pin cushion distortion that warps the image. But if the VR image on the display is warped the other way, known as barrel distortion, the two basically cancel each other out, and that's why what gets to your eye looks like a proper unwarped image. And this extends to various other kinds of artifacting as well, depending on the lens's properties of what you're using, like glare, warping, chromatic aberration, all that stuff. Those of you who have used old Fresnel-based lenses from that most past-gen headsets use compared to the more modern aspheric or pancake style have probably noticed some differences yourself. As an example, let's use glare between most Fresnel lenses compared to the aspheric and the Pimax Crystal here. I'll show on screen how aspheric and Fresnel lenses look right now. The Fresnel lenses have these many little grooves cut into the lenses, while the aspheric ones don't. In the case of glare, if the light is scattered inside the lenses, then that's how you get the little halo around objects and scenes. Because Fresnel lenses rely on a stepped surface to redirect the light, those grooves you see there. But light doesn't always follow the exact route, so sometimes you get artifacts there. Conversely, aspheric lenses tend to do a much better job at mitigating this particular artifact because of how they focus light differently without the grooves. But on the flip side, they have their own weaknesses in VR, and you got things like chromatic aberration being much more commonly reported issues from the notable consumer headsets using these, the Crystal and the Arrow. But this is only speaking generally, because there's all sorts of things you can do to a lens and the distortion profile which can affect your result. Take the Reverb G2. That has Fresnel lenses, but I hear numerous people complain about the chromatic aberration being terrible when outside the dead center. Then you get things which have bad glare even by Fresnel standards, such as the Index, because it uses a stacked lens design and it's going through 2 layers of lenses instead of just one. But the thing is that trying to correct for the entire field of view of the lens, it's hard. Both just on the lens design level, but also in the distortion profile itself. This is why you generally get the best image, which has the most minimal artifacting, when you are looking straight ahead, because that's often where you're gonna be expected to look, and that's what's optimized for. As an example, I get basically no chromatic aberration in my Crystal when looking ahead outside the worst case scenarios. But if my gaze starts to move more to the peripheral of the lenses, then yeah, it starts to become a lot more noticeable for that reason. And this is where Almalence enters the field, hoping to solve issues like that. Without eye tracking, your headset and the rendered image have no idea where your gaze is. It doesn't know if you're looking here, or way over there. And so trying to do any kind of correction without that information would just be terrible. But with it, the pre-warped image can change to get the ideal results based on if you're looking here or if you're looking over here. But is it actually that great, or does it still need some work? Well, that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. If you wish to try it out yourself before I get into my personal review, the program is available as a free OpenXR API layer that you can download. I will have a link to it and the instructions in the description down below. But a few quick notes and disclaimers about it beyond what's already been said. Firstly, at the time of this video, Almalence is not compatible with most other API layers. So you cannot use something like dynamic foveated rendering and quad views. If you have those installed, disable them via SteamVR's OpenXR API layer section. Some feedback has been given to the developer, and they already have an update they're working on, sounds like, which may address some of this incompatibility. Secondly, because it is an OpenXR API layer, it is OpenXR only. However, the hope for this tech would be for a vendor to license and integrate it into their firmware natively. At which point the dev told me it should work with every game just fine. As an external third-party program, though, it's just easier to do it this way since there's only so deep a level of access that can be had without native vendor integration and support. It's also the reason why some headsets don't have it, such as the Quest Pro, because they don't get the eye tracking data they need from public APIs. This could also potentially result in some improvements to the program's effectiveness, as right now it has to work with and around the existing distortion profile rather than replacing it entirely. Thirdly, this is a trial program because of licenses the technology depends on, and that trial expires January 31st, 2024. I've heard that they're seeing about trying to get an extension, so this may change, but like I said about the long-term goal, eventually the hope would be vendors to license and integrate themselves. Finally, though, because this plugin is about removing artifacts from the lenses to provide a better image, the better the lenses of a headset are and the less they are the bottleneck in the optical stack versus, say, the raw resolution, the more subtle some of the improvements may be, which is something we'll talk about more later. This all out of the way, let's discuss some of the major improvements on the Crystal. As of the headsets compatible with this plugin, I think it's the one that most people are going to have because the rest are enterprise focused. I'll mainly be focusing on the Chromatic Aberration and the Sharpness aspect, since those are the two things that I can capture the best and I believe will be the most readily apparent improvements for someone. So, Chromatic Aberration. Let's do that first since it's one of the most commonly cited weak points of the Crystal, and in my opinion, an area where this helps the most. Oh. Don't want you to fall. For anyone who doesn't know what it is, chromatic aberration, or color fringing, looks like this, and it typically manifests as an outline around the object. As a lens artifact, this is caused by color diffraction, where not all of the wavelengths for colors are properly focused in the same point. Hence why you get that outline and sort of off-center look since the light isn't being focused in the same area. Now, I lack the equipment to properly capture through the lens of this, since it's mainly about correcting optical distortions. So for this segment, I'm going to rely on some mock-ups to illustrate my experience and a couple materials Almalence sent me using their specialized equipment. To begin with, here are some examples Almalence took that largely address the CA issue. Now, generally, I'd say these are rather generous, and my experience wasn't this massive. These, to me, feel like an absolute best-case scenario for color fringing improvements, but those kinds of improvements did still sometimes happen now and again. I didn't notice any particular improvements on color fringing in the center area, but when looking more to the sides, where it begins to crop up, best case it could indeed look close to this at times. For a slightly more typical good, but not best case scenario, here's a little mock-up I did in the Pavlov shooting range. If I had this wall at the very edge of my vision, it looked kind of like this with the color fringing. Not that big as it gets on the outer peripheral of my vision, and I'm not going to be looking there all the time, but if I happen to look over toward that, yeah, it'd stand out because the crystal is otherwise incredibly clear. But when I turn on Almalence, the CA element on that is just gone. Not improved and not mitigated, actually gone. And because of that, it's easier to make out some of the finer details. As a bit of a side effect to this, it felt like there was a slight, I want to emphasize slight, improvement in the crystal's overall edge-to-edge clarity, since the lack of color fringing made details a little more legible and consistent further out. For example, here's another mock-up. If this image represents my right eye's FOV in the crystal, everything to the left of the red line is what I consider perfectly clear or only a very tiny image degradation that does not interfere with most details. Whereas the part between the red and green line is what improved with Almalence in a best case. Everything to the left of the green line is now what I'd consider clear or only very minor image quality loss. However, improvement is not universal here. It does depend somewhat on the environment. Pavlov's shooting range had very minimal of what I'm about to talk about, but while red and blue color fringing were about entirely eliminated, green got somewhat worse, both in terms of the view at the edges, but also how much of the image was affected by it. Unfortunately, as much as I would love to showcase how it looks typically, I don't have the right equipment to get through the lens footage, and I couldn't quite edit an image to look right and representative of how I felt in the headset, because I just learned how to do chromatic aberration for this video, and I'm still learning how to do the individual colors like that. But to again use this mock-up, if normally the color fringing, for me at least, was largely limited to say everything to the right of the red line on this image, then with Almalence on elements where it's visible, then the green color fringing was visible on everything to the right of the green line, while also getting slightly worse in general at the expense of red and blue being eliminated entirely, basically. In a worst case, it's almost like objects got a faint green shadow. And from some other people's comments I've seen, this looks like a common issue on the Crystal right now, and hopefully can be improved with updates. Generally, I would say the chromatic aberration improvements are better overall and probably worth it. However, there's still some environments where it gets less than great. Or even this absolute worst case scenario I found in Kayak VR Mirage that ruined the whole scene. This in-game capture is every bit as bad as it looked inside the headset for the green on the UI. 1-to-1. It was by far the worst artifacting I saw in any test. It was just everywhere on the white text. Kayak VR in general just didn't work all that fantastically with it, but the menu was just awful to look at. I tried about 7 games with the plugin and in various different environments within them. This is the only situation it was even half this bad, but wow, was it not pleasant. So while things generally get better on the color fringing and the slight increase on edge to edge is nice, there's still some work needed to make this perfect. Generally, I still do prefer what I see with Almalence than without it. However, this ain't the only place where Almalence claims to improve on, and that has been getting praise from people who've tried it. The other notable thing we have to talk about is the raw sharpness itself, because there's some interesting things to talk about here. So firstly, things do get somewhat, sometimes quite noticeably in some situations, sharper. Here's an example I took from a recording with a direct game capture. The one with the yellow circle is off and green is with it on. While this is not an exact representation, Almalence is designed to combat lens artifacting, so an exact comparison without that factored in isn't fully accurate. This, to me, feels somewhat like a general relative increase in the kind of sharpness you would expect. You can make out more of the fine details on the texture, and the 0.5M text almost feels like it has a film over it without Almalence. So there is a difference, and the plugin has some things which look a lot better. Like a lot. However, I was talking with somebody who used this plugin on the Reverb G2 Omnicept, one of the compatible headsets, and they described the sharpness increase as like turning on contrast adaptive sharpening, or CAS, which can be done with the VR Perf Kit or OpenXR Toolkit, depending on if your VR runtime is OpenXR or OpenVR, which did make me curious about some side-by-side comparisons. I talked to the dev. They were very clear to me sharpening is not what's going on here, and I do believe it. It's more complex than that. And while I'm not going to say on raw sharpness it was no different from CAS, because sharpening alone can potentially bring its own artifacting, it really does feel like just slightly better cast in a lot of cases in this one area, at least for close to medium distance objects. Like, I did a bunch of side-by-side comparisons between no sharpening, cast, and then Almalence, and Almalence in this specific area was just slightly better than cast, running around 0.8 sharpness or so, with one notable exception in a game we'll talk about in the next segment. But this is also something that's not entirely unexpected, as again I want to talk about lenses. This technology is all about removing as much of the bottleneck in the lenses as possible, but if the lenses aren't bottlenecked in this way and are really good, there's not much to improve on. Think about like how the Quest Pro has pretty similar fidelity to the Quest 2 screen-wise, though it's not exactly the same, contrary to what a lot of people say, because it's better in part because of using more of the effective resolution versus the Quest 2 with the optical design. But point is, changing the lenses resulted in a massive increase in fidelity beyond what even that would explain, to where I've seen quite a few people say that the Quest Pro screens are just too bad for such good lenses and it deserves a better screen. In the case of something like the Quest Pro, it's more the screens that are the limiting factor on the extra sharpness rather than the lenses. And so something like Almalence would improve on other factors a bit more noticeably because there's not much to improve to begin with. It is sort of a similar story with the Crystal, in my opinion. The Crystal's lenses are extremely clear, and part of why Pimax chose glass was because it's generally better about certain things like having high light transmission, so what reaches your eyes from the screen is well captured. They tried to make the clearest image possible already, so there's not as much to help here. This said, there were still places I found noteworthy improvements and a lot better than simply using sharpening. Objects which were much more distant and working with wide open spaces, such as say Project Wingman with its very big environments, that had a more noticeable improvement for me versus just using CAS. But unfortunately, that's hard for me to demonstrate properly on film, and so I hope you can just take my word for it again, or just try it yourself. It's a free program. So in big games where you can look out a great distance, I think this is going to benefit a little more noticeably. But in more confined environments, the raw sharpness really just felt like it was comparable to very good sharpening. However, Almalence does more things than just CAS, so I pick it basically every time because this is just one area it improves in. However, there is another good reason I'm comparing it to CAS, and that's performance. So CAS has its own slight performance overhead, and doing testing in a couple games, Almalence has one too, but it's not quite just that simple. Let me explain before anyone starts to get concerned. I talked to the developer and said that there is a slight overhead is expected. However, this applies even when the plugin is off, but as long as the API layer is active. Even if disabled via the delete key, there is still a slight hit unless you disable the API layer entirely from SteamVR's OpenXR API layer menu. But it's important to note the dev told me that this is another area that would be improved on with native integration. So it's another cost of doing it as an external program and working around existing distortion profiles. So don't take the wrong idea and assume a vendor using this would mean it costs a lot of performance. And this makes sense, because think of it like injecting an effect into a game externally, say via reshade, instead of the game naturally doing that. It's going to generally cost more via external reshade. So take what I'm about to share as more of an example of what to expect if you want to try it yourself with a remaining month or two, unless the trial gets extended, or in case you're already performance starved and need a little extra tweaking on your settings to factor in using this. If a vendor were to integrate this themselves, it could end up having little to no performance impact even. Really seems like a lot of places that would be improved with this software by doing that, huh? Anyway, I did some testing and ran a few benchmarks, so I'm going to just make this brief and also talk about some of the games. I will show the first one on screen now, but please bear in mind the 10 to 15% performance penalty I have for recording. And the first one's going to be Kayak VR Mirage, using all maxed out settings with no upscaling. I tested without Almalence or sharpening enabled as the control, then with the plugin, and then with 80% CAS sharpening with the OpenXR toolkit on separate runs. Almalence and CAS had basically identical performance within run-to-run variants, but they both saw about a 10% performance loss. That's honestly not a lot for the visual improvements, but it is still a regression some people may want to keep in mind, and how effective it was in Kayak VR varied on map to map a bit. In the forest, shown on screen, I would say that Almalence wasn't as big an improvement, and in a worst case scenario for it. Lots of green, so the worse in green CA stands out more as well. However, other maps, if we ignore the menu glitch for a moment, have a lot less green around them, and that had a more noticeable improvement in line with some of the other games I tried. And here we have RE8, where I have a lot to talk about here. This was run with the latest update on the Upscaler beta branch with almost fully maxed out, except RT and SSR, while using DLSS quality under preset D. Getting into the benchmarks, while Almalence had the most impact, it was not even a 7% regression, and the difference between Almalence and CAS using the OpenXR toolkit is barely 2 FPS. You would not notice much here. But this is basically the story throughout the whole benchmark. But this is also where I'm going to gush about the experience here, because RE8 was easily the most impressive example of Almalence to me out of anything I tested. It was like an entire tier beyond anything else. Perhaps it's the darker colors or the lightings, but the worse than green color fringing was almost unnoticeable to me in the vast majority of scenes. I actually had to go through a few areas multiple times with it on and off because the edge-to-edge clarity felt literally improved to near perfection. I didn't believe it at first. Like, there were sometimes 99% of the screen felt almost perfectly clear, such as during the scene inside the house here. Perhaps it is also the extremely high-quality assets versus most VR native games, but this really benefited on the sharpness too. While super close objects weren't as hugely benefited versus CAS, Almalence was still a step above for me, and even things no more than a few body lengths away were noticeably improved with Almalence on versus off or CAS adaptive sharpening. When I had the old man jump onto the ceiling and stare me down like this with Almalence, I got that sense of, oh, this is amazing kind of feeling that you get when you put on a new headset, which is much better than the old one. And the Crystal kind of gave me that feeling when I first tried it. If you've used a bunch of headsets, then you know how that feeling gets harder and harder to come by. I actually spent a while checking out some of the assets in RE8 and toggling Almalence on and off because I noticed a couple more subtle improvements which kind of surprised me, and I'm mad I can't properly convey them in a recording. Things in general just felt sharper and a bit more real to me. The sharpness was somewhat replicated with CAS, but things were just better to look at in more subtle ways and in general. One of the more interesting things I found was certain textures had a little greater sense of 3D-ness and depth to them. Things like, say, the brick texture right here, it just felt more real to look at. It still had a sense of being real even without the plugin, but turning Almalence on made it stand out even more. And when toggling between it on and off, I kind of suddenly started feeling like it was a little bit more flat without it on. Then there were a lot of just little details and things which were better with Almalence, almost like taking a thin film that was covering everything off. In general, RE8 is the game I would use to show this off to somebody. So, let's talk about some of the general takeaways, because I think this technology has a lot of potential, but it's still not quite there yet. Part of that, though, seems to be from the fact it is a third-party tool, so we can take maybe some conclusions with a grain of salt. I'd love to see a native integration to compare with. But as it is right now, with some of the improvements on the Crystal being more subtle, there was almost no instance where I'd prefer to not have it, though. Most of the time, I didn't get some, wow, I am blown away by this kind of improvement, but I'd still say that most of the time, I really did like it. And if I could use it in every game, assuming some compatibility issues are sorted out, I probably would, even if it did cost me a little performance. But when this shines, it really shines! Something like RE8 was shockingly better to me. It wasn't like some generational jump in performance, like going from the 8KX in the Crystal in clarity, but it was still a large improvement, which left me greatly missing it when exploring around without it, and I'm gonna really miss it once the trial's over. I think super high fidelity games benefit the most since they have the most details to appreciate. I wish I had some more OpenXR games I like to play to test this, but most games are OpenVR. Give me that native integration so I can use it in everything, damn it! This all said, there are a few major areas which do need to be patched up and fixed though. Some of these are things which sound like a native integration would fix, again, such as the performance aspect. It might even end up totally free with a native integration. But let's talk about the green color fringing since that got worse. It is a little annoying, but it's generally minor to me, outside of that one use case in Kayak VR. I would like to see it improved, but given the trial period, at the time this video is going up at least, there's only around a month and a half left. If that's not fixed by then, I wouldn't complain too much, as I believe there is a much higher priority fix I would love to see before the trial period expires and to test with. The most major fix, in my opinion, is compatibility with other tools like the OpenXR toolkit and quad views for DFR. Because as much as I like this in some games, if I had to choose between something like DFR and this, most of the time I'm gonna pick DFR unless I have performance to spare, which is much harder to come by at this resolution, even on a 4090. Depending on the game, I can see something like plus 20% or more with variable rate shading-based dynamic foveated rendering. And then there's things which support quad views, like Pavlov. I can get literally upwards of 2x or more performance. I ain't never giving that up. And I think most people would feel the same and would probably pick DFR over this when the choice is presented. And so I'd really love to see this issue addressed before the trial period's over so that people can experience both dynamic foveated rendering and distortion correction. Pair up those two and you have a really good reason to show why eye tracking is such a big deal. I already never want to buy another headset without eye tracking again as my daily driver. And I think it is a huge mistake to not have it at the high end, because both these improvements feel like a generational leap when you put them together. This technology is the future, and things like this provide a glimpse into it within the present day. I may even do a brief revisit of this if the compatibility issues are solved before the trial expires, or if Pimax natively integrates it into the Crystal. And there is the video. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. What do you think of the plugin? Are you excited about eye tracking as I am? Did you try it for yourself and find it more or less impressive than I did? Do you want to see this integrated in the Crystal? Let me know in the comments. If you liked the video, consider sticking around to see what I do next. If not, well, thanks for making it this far anyway, and maybe I will see you again sometime. Later!